Hello and welcome to Week 1, Module 1 of Economics 101, Microeconomics at Thomas More College. In this video, I will walk you through kind of a view from the sky of this module, what it's all about, and what you can expect to see in this module. Now, the title of this module is the Fundamental Economic Question, which raises the question, what is the fundamental economic question? And that question is, how do we deal with scarcity? Well, scarcity just means that we don't have enough resources. So what is scarce is the four fundamental resources. And because resources are scarce, everything that can be produced is scarce. If we didn't have scarcity of our economic resources, we would be able to produce as much as we wanted without limit, but that's not the case at all. So how do we deal with that? How do we answer the three important questions of what gets produced, how do we produce it, and how do we distribute that production? So before we go on, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by these resources. Now, in economics, whenever we say resources, we mean four specific things. Land, which we usually abbreviate with a lowercase l. Labor, which we usually abbreviate with an uppercase L. Capital, which we usually abbreviate with a letter K. And technology, which actually, depending on the textbook you have, you might see it represented in a variety of ways, but we'll probably use A the most consistently in this course. Now, you might be assuming some things about what those mean. Before we go on to the rest of the course, I want to make sure I address a couple of common misperceptions about what each of these mean. Land actually means natural resources. So it's not just physical land. It's not just what your feet are resting on right now. It's things like lumber, wheat, things like that. Labor just means work effort. So labor can refer to either how many workers you have or how many hours you hire those workers, but labor in general means work effort. Now, two that frequently get confused and kind of muddled together are capital and technology. Capital is things like tools and equipment or factories. Anything that is made that can make other things is capital. Let me go ahead and write that out. Something is made, something made that is used to produce other things. So that means something like a computer, which a lot of people would commonly refer to as technology, isn't actually technology. In this course, whenever we say technology, we're going to mean something very different. A computer would be capital. Now, what do we mean then by technology? Technology is basically know-how. It's knowing how to put all of these other resources together to create goods and services. Now, economics is a pretty broad field, as we covered in the introduction to the course. But we're going to also talk a little bit in this module about how economists try to answer this question and related questions. And one of the primary ways that economists analyze problems is they use models. And these can take three forms. They can take the form of graphical models. They can take the form of words, so analytical models. And they can take the form of mathematical models. So in other words, things like equations. And we're going to see, to a certain extent, all three of these in this course. Now, for that reason, and because it may have been a while since you used graphs, one of the big parts of this first module is making sure you're comfortable with the Cartesian plane. So if you remember from some math class, maybe even a math class long ago, you saw something like this. This was on your y-axis and this was on your x-axis, and maybe you had curves that looked like this. Y is equal to a plus bx. Hopefully that looks somewhat familiar. Because we in economics use this pretty heavily. Now luckily we usually restrict ourselves to this first quadrant right here. So we usually just make that into a shortcut that looks like this, And what we do with these models is we're trying to show the relationship between whatever is on this axis and whatever is on this axis. So for example, if I want to show the relationship between price and quantity, right? So let's say I knew that as the price of something went up, as the number on this axis got bigger, the quantity got smaller, I might draw a relationship like this. So this is actually an example of something we'll see later in this module, which is a demand curve, which just shows that as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. So we would move that way along a curve, showing the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Now, another thing that economists do when they're trying to answer this and other questions is that they tend to focus on something called positive analysis rather than something called normative analysis. Positive analysis is focusing on facts and testable ideas. So in other words, a hypothesis, something that we can test. Normative analysis is instead focusing on opinion. So an economist tries to at least describe a problem before they start to have an opinion on that problem. And hopefully throughout this course you'll keep this in mind. We want to, at this point, we want to just focus on positive analysis. Now we need to keep a couple of important assumptions in mind as we go through the course as well. And these are assumptions that economists just take for granted, and so you might not hear them restated again, but you need to keep these in mind as they come up. The first assumption is something called ceteris paribus. We're assuming that the only thing that might be changing at the moment is the thing that we are talking about. Everything else is equal. So in that demand curve on the last slide, the reason why quantity demanded was changing was because price was changing. Nothing else was changing. Our income isn't changing. The prices of other goods aren't changing. Along that demand curve, we're assuming that nothing else is changing. Now, that doesn't mean that economists assume nothing ever changes. It's just we make this simplifying assumption so we can focus on one thing at a time. The other important assumption that we make is that people, in fact, since we're not just talking about people in economics, we typically mean firms and individuals and even sometimes entire countries, we instead call these agents. So an agent is just somebody who is some sort of decision maker. Now, the assumption we make in economics is that all of these agents are rational. And what we mean by rational in economics is different than what a psychologist would mean by rational. In economics, we assume that nobody does anything to intentionally make themselves worse off, and we assume that people who are buying things are something called utility maximizers. And all that word utility means is happiness. Given our constraints in life, we try to make ourselves as happy as possible. And we assume that producers are, all else equal, profit maximizers. Maybe they have other interests, but for now we assume that right now they only want to focus on making profit. So what are your next steps going forward? Well, before you start this module in particular, you need to make some time to get acquainted with the course. And that includes watching the introductory video to the course, which you probably have read already at this point, but also read the syllabus. That is critically important. Make sure you have all of your required materials, and make sure you read the discussion forum guidelines so that you are prepared to make a well-formed discussion when the time comes. Then start with Introduction to Economics. And that is our very first module. And as a reminder, you can always go to what this page is on. This is on your checklist. All of this is on your checklist. You can use that to go to things directly by the link. Or down at the bottom of each of those pages, there will be a little next button. And you can just click through next each time, and it'll take you to each of the next things. The only exception to that is on some of these reading assignments. Notice that that doesn't have a link. That means you need to do that, and it won't be in the next on the next button. As a reminder, if you have any questions during this module, there will be a special discussion forum for each module. Make sure you post any questions you have there, because if you have a question, probably somebody else has the same question, and we're all in this together, so let's share information. Okay, see you in the course. Onward.